It's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Dr. Mark Staniforth. Mark is the Senior Lecturer in Archaeology at Flinders University. He teaches maritime archaeology as a part of the postgraduate school there, which draws students from around Australia and overseas. His topic this evening is underwater archaeology in South Australia, and understand areas he will cover include the Abandoned Ships Project at Garden Island, the investigation of historic maritime structures around the state, and the salvaging and preservation of maritime artefacts. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and I have to say it's an honour to speak to the Historical Society of South Australia, and I'd like to thank you for inviting me to come here this evening and talk to you about archaeology, about underwater archaeology, and about maritime archaeology. Now, perhaps I should start by saying a little bit about myself, and starting with a confession. I'm a West Australian, not a South Australian. I've only been here since the end of 1993. And before that, I've worked in almost all Australian states on shipwreck excavations, starting in Western Australia way back in 1974. And I've also worked for the Victorian State Government as their state maritime archaeologist during the early 1980s. I worked for the Commonwealth Government in the National Maritime Museum during the late 1980s and early 1990s. When I came here at the end of 93, it was to do a PhD in archaeology at Flinders University. And at that stage, Flinders offered a relatively small program in archaeology. It's taught archaeology since way back in the 1980s, but it wasn't a particularly large program. Since that time, the program has grown somewhat, and I was lucky enough to get a job there at the beginning of 1997. I'm currently the acting head, while the head's away overseas on sabbatical, lucky man. So the department's grown considerably, the sorts of things that we teach have grown considerably, and I hope this evening that I'll have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what we teach, and indeed why we might teach underwater and maritime archaeology in this state. So what is underwater archaeology? And perhaps the easiest way is to show you some slides. In Australia, when you think about underwater archaeology, you tend to think about shipwrecks. And for many years there has been a great concentration on shipwreck archaeology, if you like. Indeed, you can trace the roots of underwater archaeology in this country back to the work done in Western Australia on the Dutch shipwrecks program. As some of you will know, we had a number of Dutch ships that were lost on the West Australian coast as early as 1629, which makes them some of the earliest European structures and European artefacts in Australia. Now, if you think about shipwrecks, the concentration has been legislatively, administratively through government to focus in on shipwreck sites. And a variety of other cultural material that ends up underwater has been pretty much left to the side. There hasn't been a lot of work done on some of the other aspects of maritime cultural heritage apart from shipwrecks. We've had shipwrecks legislation, for example, at a national level since 1976. We've had state shipwrecks legislation in the state of South Australia since 1981. So it means that government has spent a lot of time and effort and a certain amount of money, I wouldn't say a large amount of money, on looking at, finding out about, studying, sometimes excavating, and putting on display material from historic shipwrecks. I'd have to say that you may have heard some of that work from a variety of people who have worked for the state government over the years. People like Bill Jeffrey, who's currently out of the state and living in North Queensland, again, lucky man, doing a PhD at James Cook University. Or perhaps you've heard from Terry Arnott, who is the current acting maritime officer at Heritage SA in Bill's Place. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about things other than shipwrecks. I've stuck a dirty great slide up there and indicated that they're important things, and I wanted to make that acknowledgement. But one of the problems really that we have had in South Australia and more generally in Australia is that we haven't focused very much on anything other than shipwrecks. Now, why might we want to focus on any other material other than shipwrecks that might be underwater? Well, there's a lot more to underwater archaeology than just shipwrecks. Around the world there are various sites which are of interest, and even in South Australia we have a number of different sorts of sites which are underwater. Indigenous sites, for example. In times of lower sea level, the Indigenous people were walking around out on the areas which are now below water, and they were leaving the same sorts of archaeological sites that we can see in terrestrial sites today. There's been virtually no work done on Indigenous sites underwater in this state. Indeed, I'm happy to say that I can show you nothing in that particular area. I can simply flag it for you as an issue that South Australia at one point will have to come to terms with. A variety of other sites though, and I'll talk a bit about some of these as we go along, and the sorts of sites are things like jetties. Jetty sites are quite interesting because quite often in the earliest days of settlement, as you will all know, it was very much a maritime community. Transportation was done by sea. Getting ashore, getting out to the boats and back was often done by jetty. There were some of the earliest structures in this state. There's some quite interesting material culture there. So I'll talk a little bit about jetty sites. I'll talk to you a little bit about the way in which we teach underwater and maritime archaeology. And then, as David suggested, one of my interests is in fact in whaling stations, in particular the 17 or so whaling stations that were on the South Australian coast. And I'll talk to you a little bit about those as well. I'll also talk to you about the Abandoned Shipwrecks project, which perhaps some of you have heard before. I was talking to John before, and he suggested that he'd actually heard one of my PhD students, Nathan Richards, who has for the last few years been working on the Abandoned Ships project, and I'll talk to you a bit about that as well. And I'll also talk to you about the training that's available, not just to students, but to members of the public and specifically to scuba divers through programs called the AIM and NAS training program. What then am I talking about? What is archaeology underwater? Well, to me, as a teacher of archaeology, it's simply that it is archaeology and it's conducted simply in a different environment. The same principles of recording, photographing, keeping meticulous records, in some cases using scientific techniques to analyse material, they're all tied up in our approach to archaeology. It's not simply collecting things. A lot of people think that archaeologists are just about grabbing stuff, bits and pieces, and that's not what we do. We spend a lot of time recording, photographing, measuring meticulously shipwreck sites and other sites underwater. Now, the thing about my approach tonight is going to be that I'm not just going to talk about underwater, because if you think about it, the maritime environment actually extends onto the land. And so in those early days when people were travelling around by sea, certainly some of their ships end up on the seabed. Others end up on the beach and they're actually on land. Some of the material, of course, never ends up underwater, but it's maritime related, and my focus is very much about maritime archaeology. And so what you'll see is quite a lot of photographs which are not actually underwater. I want to go back to some of the projects which really provided the impetus for underwater archaeology in South Australia. And before there was a government involvement in this state, there was an amateur or avocational interest. Scuba divers in particular, but interested people got involved in something called the Society for Underwater Historical Research, which had its genesis way back in the mid-1970s. About the same time, I joined its sister organisation in Western Australia, something called the Maritime Archaeology Association of Western Australia. And therefore I'm very familiar with avocational or amateur groups. They are, in many respects, the backbone of a lot of the work that happens in underwater archaeology. As you can imagine, there's not huge amounts of government money around for this sort of stuff. And so if you want to do anything, it takes a lot of other people other than what one might call professional people to be involved in it. So way back in the 1970s, the Society for Underwater Historical Research conducted some work on Holdfast Bay Jetty. As a result, the site was actually declared under the Relics Act, and a lot of material was raised, and some of it went on display in the South Australian Maritime Museum. The Society for Underwater Historical Research underwent a period when it was very inactive. For about 10 years, very little activity happened. Most of the members were busy with other things, their lives, their kids, various other things, and the society went into hibernation, if you like. It was revamped a few years ago, primarily as a result of my own students showing interest in getting the organisation back on track. And one of the projects that they actually took up was indeed the very first project that SUHR had been involved in, and that's the Holdfast Bay project. And that was very timely, of course, with the development of the Holdfast Shores going on down in Glenelg. And it's really interesting that certainly the cycle came round some 25 years later that there was community or public interest in the sort of heritage material that lies literally just off the beach at Glenelg. And certainly there's little support in government for funding that. So they actually got a lot of community interest, a lot of divers came along, they got support from local businesses, and they conducted a partial test excavation on the site again to see how much more material was left. And that work has been written up by a couple of my honours students in recent years as major studies. Jetty sites are very interesting sites. They are often among the earliest of European settlements, European structures in South Australia. One of my honours students from last year is currently doing some work with Heritage South Australia on a database of all the jetty sites in South Australia. And this, for anybody who might recognise it, is the Point Reeves site at Kingscote on Kangaroo Island, which is, in fact, that's the second jetty there, but the first jetty there is, again, one of the earliest structures in South Australia. The second jetty is just slightly later. I want to talk now a little bit about whaling. In 1997, Dr. Susan Lawrence from La Trobe University and I set up a little project called the Archaeology of Whaling in Southern Australia. And we thought this was an interesting idea because there was quite a lot of early whaling in South Australia and indeed in the whole southern part of Australia. As we moved into the project, we found that there was a huge amount of interest from people who we really didn't expect. The New Zealanders, for example, suddenly piped up and said, well, we've got all of these sites down here in New Zealand, why don't you extend your project to us as well? And so we stuck them onto the project and it became the Archaeology of Whaling in Southern Australia and New Zealand. Oh, the Oil Sands project. We put together a small conference in 1998 and published the proceedings. And that really has provided the baseline from which we've been doing some of our studies of whaling in South Australia. Now, you might ask why? Why might an archaeologist like me be interested in whaling? And you need to think about what is the historical record, I suppose. What sorts of historical records exist? And one of the problems that you will find if you start going looking for historical records on an industry like whaling is that there aren't very many. And there are very good reasons for that. There are very good reasons such as the people who actually conduct it are not particularly literate people. They don't write a lot about their activities. They don't have the time. They don't have the inclination. They don't have the skills to write about it. Another reason, of course, is that they don't have the reasons to write about it. And the reasons are that if you're conducting a whaling operation and you're killing lots of whales, you're making a lot of money doing that. And you don't particularly want to tell every man and his dog that you're doing that, or the location that you're doing that. You want to keep that quiet. You don't want to tell people how many whales you're getting or where you're getting them. And so what we found is that when you do start looking at the records are not there. When you do actually trace down where some of these whalers were coming from, they were quite often coming from interstate, New South Wales, Victoria, but primarily Tasmania. And when you actually look at the records and you say, well, we know that this vessel turns up on the South Australian coast and sets up a whaling station from a one-line report in an early South Australian newspaper. And that's all we've got. When you trace its records in Tasmania, of course, it says it's going whaling in the South Seas. South Seas meaning the South Australian coast, interestingly enough, not, as you might have thought, the real South Seas or the South Pacific. So there's very little in the way of documentary sources about how these operations worked, about how many people lived there, about whether they were all men, for example. The great stereotype of whaling is that it's a male operation. Heaps and heaps of blokes out there on the South Australian coast. Until you find the odd one-liner saying that one of the headsmen took his wife, an 8-year-old daughter, out to the site for the season in 1844. Again, a one-line piece of information giving you that sort of insight into the way in which whaling is conducted in these early days. My first experience of looking at whaling station sites in South Australia was a request from the South Australian Museum. Kath Kemper, who is the curator of mammals there, approached me and said, we need an archaeologist to come out with us and help while we're digging up some bones for a reference collection at the museum. The museum apparently had no right whale bones in its reference collection, and they wanted a collection of these things. And what they'd been told was that there were a number of these bones appearing in some four-wheel drive tracks at a place called Point Fowler on the far west coast. Now, Point Fowler is the last bay. Fowler's Bay is the last bay that you can stop in, that you can get a ship to anchor in before you reach the area of the Head of the Bight. And the Head of the Bight is an impossible anchorage. You simply can't keep your vessel there. And one of the reasons that we still have a whale population is that in the 19th century they found it quite difficult to whale in the area of the Head of the Bight. It's too exposed, the cliffs there are too difficult. And so the last place that they could really work out of was Fowler's Bay. We know from Edward John Eyre's memoirs that there were a couple of American whalers that were in Fowler's Bay in the early days. We also know from, again, a single line extract in an early newspaper that a couple of young blokes managed to walk from Fowler's Bay most of the way to Port Lincoln. Now think about that, it's a very long way. And they managed this in 1845. And they were picked up somewhat short of Port Lincoln. And they mentioned that they'd come from a whaling station at Fowler's Bay. And so we had this one-line piece of information, and we had this report of whale bones appearing on a four-wheel drive track. So we went out with Kath, and fair enough, whale bones. Lots and lots and lots of them. And they're all appearing alongside this four-wheel drive track. And there's no real problem about that, you might think. They're obviously southern right whales. Kath identified them. She started excavating quite happily. Got a wonderful collection, reference collection for the museum. We started looking around to see if there were any cultural traces, to see what sorts of remnants the people who had been whaling in that area had left. And the problem that we faced is very much that there is a lack of visibility. And we refer to it as archaeological visibility, and what it means is that if there's a lot of vegetation, you basically can't see anything. What we did see is things like this. This is a black glass, approximately mid-19th century black glass bottle that has been driven up and down on a few times by the four-wheel drive driving up and down the track. So that indicates that there are people there in the 1840s or thereabouts. It's really too early to be the pastoralists who roll up there in the 1870s. So we started having a look. we started doing things like transects, field walking, actually seeing what we could see on the ground. So you get a string of volunteers or students, and you line them up across the landscape, and you take them out there and say, find me things. You know, if you find anything, call out and I'll come and have a look at it. Now, the first problem, of course, that you've got is very much that the four-wheel drive track that you can see is that track in the foreground. And you'll realise that the sea is a very long way away from that. That's a couple of 100 metres, in fact. And the first question that we immediately faced was, is this, in fact, historical period whalebone, or is this something that has been there for a very long time? Because this seems like a very major change in the topography. So part of our excavation phase was to actually dig down to see what we could find in the stratigraphy, in the layers of the earth. And what we found was that the original beach level was about 1.5 metres down. What we also found is that that beach level was the beach level in the 1840s, right? Because this whalebone and the cultural material is all there. And what has happened is that the beach basically has advanced. The sand has built up over that 150 or plus year period until the sea is 200 metres away. Quite a major topographical change. As a result, for an archaeologist, it's not a great sight because everything is obscured. 1.5 metres of sand, 200 metres of progression on the beach, a very difficult site to try and find. And in fact, we never found the whaling station site. I don't know whether anyone ever will. What we found instead is by far the most complete lookout, whaling lookout, in South Australia. It's right up on the point, and it doesn't look much from a distance. It's a bit more impressive when you get up close to it. And as a building style, it certainly reminded me of the sort of structures that the Dutch shipwreck castaways had been constructing as early as the 1620s, when they were wrecked on the West Australian coast. It's basically the same sort of structure. Local limestone simply piled up to form what is effectively a windbreak, a way of getting out of the wind. Now, the problem with local limestone, of course, is that anyone could have done this, couldn't they? This could have been done by shipwreck survivors in the 1600s. It could have been done by whalers in the 19th century. It could have been done by a bunch of kids 10 years ago. So as an archaeologist, you've got an immediate problem. How do you tell whether this is a whaling lookout or not? And we looked at it in a couple of ways. One was its location, certainly as a location for, say, a protected area for shipwreck survivors. What they would want to do is they would want to look out to the ocean, because their salvation would be coming from the ocean, if you like. If they were up there building this thing in order to protect themselves from the wind so that they could build a fire when a ship came along, the primary interest would be actually looking out. Unfortunately, this thing's built in behind the front area of this point, and you can't, standing there, see anywhere out to the southwest where most of the vessels will be coming from. You can see due south, you can see southeast, but you can't see southwest. So logically, it's not the sort of place that shipwreck survivors might build. We know from some of the early historic maps that this particular structure is marked on the maps as early as 1869, which is in fact before the pastoralists get there. And so we know it's a very old structure. It might have been a shipwreck survivor's structure, but we happen to think that it is a whaling lookout. And the same thing works in reverse. The view that it actually has is into Fowler's Bay, and it has the best view of the bay itself. And the reason it needed that view, of course, is to see the whales as they come into the bay. And as they come in, they send up a signal, either a cannon shot or a fire or a flag, something that can be seen from the whaling station site, tells them that the whale's coming into the bay. They can take the boats out there and go and kill the whale. So it's a wonderful site. We've worked on a number of sites on the far west coast. We had a record, for example, another little story about the limited nature of the historical record. And that's that we knew that there was a whaling station at a place called Trial Bay on the west coast. Unfortunately, none of the maps, none of the documentation actually indicates where Trial Bay is. And what we got was one of the locals reported in 1994 to Heritage SA that he'd found what he believed to be a whaling station site at a place called Yanabe on Scale Bay. And we dropped in on the way back from the Fowler's Bay work that we'd done into Scale Bay, into Yanabe, and we had a look at the site, and very unimpressive. Bits and pieces. Whaling station sites tend to be unimpressive when you see them on the surface. One of the interesting things about them is that people walk over them all the time and don't recognise them for what they are. It does actually take a practised eye to see a whaling station site. I often go out to a place and I take my students and I say, whaling station site's over there, you wander over and I'll do something over here for a while, and I let them go and have a look. And usually they wander over it, wander back, and then think, we've missed it. Wander over it again, then wander back and go, didn't we go far enough? And you say, no, you've now walked over it 4 times. Have a closer look at the ground. It's there if you look closely and if you know what to look for. This is a little part of an excavation which we did inside the whaling lookout at Fowler's Bay, slightly out of order. So, I was saying about the ephemeral nature of these sites. Whaling station sites on the South Australian coast are very ephemeral. There's very little material remains left on them. They quite often only operated for 1, 2, perhaps 3 seasons. In many respects, to an archaeologist, they look a bit like a shipwreck site because they're almost this self-contained event, or very short period event. They're quite unlike other archaeological sites which tend to get built over all the time. And you work downtown in an urban site, for example, and there's 200 years of building and rebuilding and sites being destroyed, material going over the top of it all the time. These sites, there's been nothing happen to them. Quite often in very remote places, and there has been no building subsequently. And that's one of the best things about them. But when you look at them, there's not much to see. And we went out to Yanabe and wandered about with a couple of consultant archaeologists. That's the one with the hat and the beer can in his hand. They were getting paid and we weren't. And wandered about and looked at the site and thought, yeah, possibly. Debate, considerable debate over many more beers, about whether this was a whaling station or not. Very hard to be sure. We started looking on the ground and we started seeing bricks. Well, bricks good, that's fine. A lot of the bricks actually had black on them. Now, bricks get burnt in all sorts of ways, even in bushfires. They can also come from harbours and so they'll be black. One of the interesting things is that if they have been associated with any form of try-works, they often have a black sticky substance which has basically stuck to or soaked into the bricks. And that's quite distinctive. Once you've looked at a few of these things, you can pick a piece of brick up and go, I know where that's from. But the best of all is when you can excavate, as we did, a little trench and actually find that black stuff and the bricks surrounding it that actually represent the try-works platform, which is where the blubber is boiled down for the oil. And that's what we found at Yanabe. And the good thing about that is it puts totally beyond doubt that this is a whaling station site. So one of the things that we did in this particular case was positively identify the Yanabe site as Trial Bay. Much other material. One of the things about any human beings is that they do tend to leave a fair trail of detritus behind them. They're rubbish generators. And that's good for archaeologists because it means you start to see around an archaeological site some traces of their activities in the 1840s. And those traces are often quite distinctive. The sorts of bottles and the sorts of ceramics that you get on these sites are often quite distinctive. And we excavated a couple of areas. This is an area which we suspect to be a salvage campsite, very close to the whaling station, but we think that this is where they were salvaging a couple of vessels that were actually wrecked in the bay in the 1840s. When we went checking into some of the records, we actually found that the salvagers recorded going into the bay and seeing the whalers there. And that's one of the few ways in which you actually get a documentary insight into the fact that the whalers are there. A few years ago, I was fortunate enough to go out with Heritage SA in one of our little cooperative ventures to a place called Flinders Island, which is, as some of you may know, some kilometres off Elliston on the west coast of the Eyre Peninsula. Privately owned island, and we flew in, found a site with lots of bits of brick with all this black stuff on it, and by that stage we knew enough to say, oh yeah, that looks pretty convincing as a whaling station site. We found, interestingly, some Aboriginal tools. And this is quite interesting because the site at Flinders Island is 38 kilometres off Elliston and has never been connected to the shore in known history, in recent times. And so there's actually no record of an Indigenous presence on the island, except for a whaler sealer who was there in the 1820s and took along two kidnapped Aboriginal women, one of whom he'd managed to kidnap in Tasmania and another of whom he'd got from the coast of South Australia down near the mouth of the Murray. And he took them over there and set them to work, as they were wont to do. And one of the interesting things for us is that we find evidence of these two women in these sites. Again, not particularly impressive until it's excavated. Just a ring of stones with a number of bricks in it, which suggests that it's try-works and whaling station. And this wonderful white hammerstone with a piece broken off it. And interestingly, looking at the geology of the island, there are only two main types of stone, a pink granite and a white limestone. And this stuff doesn't occur naturally. It's a water-worn pebble and has been imported, along with the Aboriginal women, from quite some distance away. Another site that I want to speak briefly about is a site much closer to home. It's a site which we excavated late last year, in December in fact, down at Cape Jervis. I first got interested in the Cape Jervis site way back in 1994 when we returned from the Fowler's Bay excavation. And Fowler's Bay is such a long way away that we started looking for a site that was a bit closer to home to do some research, to potentially take some students down and do some work on. And the closest site we could find to home, apart from one that was supposedly at the mouth of the Onkaparinga River, was this one, just down at Cape Jervis, just before you go on the ferry to Kangaroo Island. It's known as Fishery Bay. It's clear that there was a whaling station there. There's some documentary record. And we went down there and had a look at it. And unfortunately, first look indicated that it had been really badly messed about. If you go down there today, it's a really bad area for people on motorbikes, trail bikes. It's really chewed up. And what bits haven't been chewed up by the motorbikes, the local councils decided to dump stuff there. And the other thing is that it's the end of the electricity cable to Kangaroo Island. So every man and his dog's been there to dig the place up. So for an archaeologist, it's not pristine, unlike some of the sites out on the west coast. But there's still traces if you start looking for them. There's still bits of brick. And interestingly enough, beginning of last year, Terry Arnott went down there and located what he thought might be the remains of a house site, which actually matched the historical description which we have of a house site belonging to the headsman of the whaling station, the manager of the whaling station, up on a little knoll area, a little hill overlooking the beach. And so we got permission to do a test excavation, to dig on that site, to try and find out really whether or not it was a house site at all, and whether or not it was a house site associated with a whaling station. Now, this is an interesting process because that is what we were looking at. And that is not a very prepossessing site to start with. When we looked on the ground, you can just see a very slightly elevated area and a couple of bits of the local slate rock. And this, you sort of stood there and we talked about it, and oh, you know, this doesn't look great. It's possible. There's really not too many ways around it. You've got to try and dig. Because when you dig, you start to find lines, you start to find hearts, you start to find the foundations of walls. By the time you're finished, it's not a construction that we made. It's actually a construction that they made at the time. And what you find is a very obvious hearth, including an area just here to the left, which is probably an area where they stowed their tools for working in the hearth. Off to the left is 2 rows of stones where they had the slabs. They held the slabs for the walls up. There are post holes here, all sorts of small traces of this particular site that we revealed in the excavation. And of course, the small items that bring the people back. Clay tobacco pipes, bits of glass, bits of ceramic from that sort of early 1840s period that start to re-inhabit the sites, if you like. Looking from above, you can see the hearth on the left-hand side. We've followed the line of rocks out into another area, open area, which includes a number of post holes, and you can see the view that it's got over the top of the working area. By this stage, of course, we've looked at a whaling station lookout, we've looked at a whaling station house site. One of the things that we hadn't found at either of them was a try-works. And as David suggested at the beginning of this talk, last week we were out at Port Lincoln at a site at Fishery Bay, Sleaford Bay, excavating a try-works, because it's the best preserved try-works in South Australia. We conducted some early pre-disturbance work there back in 1997, and one of the recommendations that came out of our work was that we told Heritage South Australia, this thing's falling into the ocean. You've got a management problem here. If you just leave it, it will fall into the ocean. It's eroding, the rocks are falling away, it's falling into the ocean. And after a while, they watched it for a few years and realised that it really was falling into the ocean. And when we did the measurements just before we started the excavation a week or so ago, we found that they'd lost something like between 30 centimetres and 45 centimetres of the front of the site. It had literally washed away in the 4 years since we did the work in 1997. As a result, we excavated the site and we built a very solid Hessian bag wall in front of it, which hopefully will protect the site in situ, because it's a very important archaeological site in terms of being one of the earliest structures in South Australia. We know that there were whalers there in 1837, so it's quite important. I wanted to mention a site which I don't want to show you any photographs of, but it's a site which you may have heard about. It's the Abandoned Shipwrecks project, which Nathan Richards has been working on. And it's a point which I want to make to you about what we have here in South Australia. We have one of the largest and most diverse ships' graveyards, certainly in Australia and probably anywhere in the world. It sits up there in the north arm of the Port Adelaide River. It includes a variety of vessels, including one of the most complete unrestored iron sailing ships, the Santiago, which simply sits in the North Arm. Built in the 1870s, a very early example, built in fact in the 1850s, a very early example of iron shipbuilding. We have a second one, the Sunbeam, which is lying on the foreshore at North Arm. And so very important sites, a whole variety of material, paddle steamers, barges, dredgers, all sorts of things sitting up there. When Nathan started the work, we thought we had something like 20 vessels. Last count, I think it was 80 that we know of in that general area of North Arm, Barker Inlet, Jervois Basin, etc. The Abandoned Shipwrecks project is a very important part of the sort of work that we're doing in the department. That work includes teaching undergraduates. We teach maritime archaeology, underwater archaeology to undergraduates from literally their first day at university. We open up, in fact, on the very first lecture in first year with a a short section on underwater archaeology for them. We teach them all the way through their undergraduate years. They can't avoid it, if you like. More importantly, we are starting to teach postgraduate work. The program has built up to the point now where we're starting to attract postgraduates not just from interstate but from overseas. We ran a field school at Port Victoria earlier this year which attracted overseas students. I'm planning another field school in February of next year which already has 30 applicants for 20 places, including 6 overseas students and 10 students from the University of Sydney. So it's a surprisingly important part of the teaching of archaeology at Flinders. We're involved with organisations like SUHR, we're involved in cooperative, collaborative work with Heritage SA. We're also involved in the public training of interested people, in particular scuba divers, through a program called the AIM and NAS program. I've got some brochures and things for you to have a look at if you're interested. You don't have to be a diver to be involved in the AIM and NAS program, although this was some of the training conditions that we took some of the students out to do some underwater photography in very low visibility conditions. And unfortunately that one's upside down, but this is a pool session where we're teaching students about recording and underwater photography in the pool. AIM&S training is a 4-part training program that's internationally recognised. It was actually imported back in about 1998 from the UK, but it's recognised in the US, Canada and most of Europe. And I wanted to finish by saying I'm still involved on a day-to-day basis, and the department's still involved in teaching of interested people, divers in particular, but anybody who wants to work on or around underwater or maritime archaeological science. It's a critical part of what we do on an everyday basis. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'll take questions. Yes, I was a volunteer initially for the museum when I was at high school. I worked on a number of Dutch wrecks, and in particular I worked on the Colonial Wrecks program. And later on I got a job as a research assistant for the Maritime Museum in the 1970s. So that's where I started out. Yeah, an important part of what we do is to work closely with Heritage SA, because as a research archaeologist, one of the things that I do in some respects is to destroy archaeological sites, because once you excavate them you can't actually put them back together again. You can leave the structure, and we usually will leave the building structure there, but you can't actually put the stratigraphy back together. You can't put the artefacts back in the same position that they were in. So when you excavate, it's a process of destruction, so you have to have a very good reason for excavating. But at the end of it, there's almost always some form of structure left in our case. It might be a triworks platform, it might be a house site foundations. And we work closely with them in order to preserve that material into the long-term future. And with the site that we were working on at the triworks platform out at Port Lincoln, what we did was we put a wall of hessian bags in the front of it. Then we refill the site carefully, including using shade cloth and then sand over the top of it, and then refilling it right up to its original ground level, so that the site is protected, and so that the next archaeologist who comes along perhaps and digs it up in 100 years' time knows that we've excavated at least a part of that site, and they know that we have left what we can intact, and that's always the structure. Yeah. Underwater archaeology is an interesting term. It literally means archaeology conducted underwater. As a result, it doesn't have a great deal of coherence as a discipline. Underwater archaeologists work on indigenous sites, aircraft underwater, shipwrecks underwater. They work on material which is from the Bronze Age, for example. I have colleagues who work in the Mediterranean who, they're working on stuff from 1300 AD, BC, and it's 3,500 years old. That's actually a very different kind of archaeology in some respects, and so it's interesting that underwater archaeology covers a huge field, and it includes maritime archaeology, and maritime archaeology kind of covers not just stuff that's underwater, but material that's associated with seafaring operations and maritime activity. So that might be a ship and a shipwreck, but it might also be wharves or jetties that are needed in order to get the material to and from a shipwreck. It might include things like lighthouses. It might be a maritime industry like the whaling industry. And that's why if you start seeing maritime archaeology as the archaeology of maritime industry, you start seeing that it's not just underwater. And therefore I work as an underwater archaeologist, sometimes underwater, sometimes on land, but almost always on maritime sites, because that's where my focus of interest is. And almost always on sites dating to this recent period, because I'm an Australian archaeologist and I work on Australian sites. So my interest focuses in on basically the late 18th and pretty much most of the 19th and a bit of the 20th century in terms of archaeological sites. I hope that makes it clear. Yeah.
The abandoned whaling station I've seen is at Deception Island in Antarctica, and the amount of material left there is astonishing compared to the material that's shown here.
Yeah.
So,
these were very small operations. One of the interesting things about whaling is that the colonials get into it very late. Effectively, they'd missed the bus. The Americans had been here, the French had been here, the British had been here, they'd all had big ships and lots of money, and they'd done lots of whaling, and they'd done enormous damage to the whale populations. And the colonials was watching all of this money suddenly disappear offshore, and what they saw as their own, resource. They thought, this is a good idea. All we need is a few boats, go and set up in a bay somewhere. Not a huge input of money, and we can get a few whales and we can sell this oil. It is, of course, a global industry. The oil is absolutely and totally useless where they've got it. I mean, you don't want whale oil on the west coast of South Australia. It's utterly useless. It's got to go a very long way. And in fact, the whale oil goes all the way back to Britain because it's used to light the streets of cities like London. Whale oil lamps is the main way of lighting the city of London in the 1830s and 1840s. Unfortunately, the colonials have missed the boat. Within a year or two of getting into it, the whale population's gone down so badly, there's nothing to whale. There aren't any whales. And you get regular accounts of people turning up in Port Adelaide saying, we were at the whaling station on Thistle Island and we didn't see a whale for the entire season, and they didn't resupply us, and we're starving. And we need some food. We've rowed all the way from Thistle Island, which is way over on the Eyre Peninsula, and we're not very happy, So that sort of story's coming out in the 1840s. And these whaling stations are spectacularly unsuccessful. Almost none of them made any money at all. The ones, in fact, that do make money were the secret ones. And it's hard to tell how much money some of those made because, of course, they're mainly from Hobart and Launceston, and they're not telling anybody how many whales they got. They're doing it, we suspect, for a few more years, and they're picking up on places where there are still a few whales, and they're making a half success of it. But certainly the South Australian company's experience in whaling was a total and utter disaster. And quite often the whaling stations only last a year or two. For example, at the site we worked at Sleaford Bay, when we dug up the try works, it was quite clear where they'd spent the money. There are records, the South Australian company has much better records than anybody else on whaling, and they record spending £900 in a season at this whaling station. And you can see it because it's better than any other whaling station I've ever seen in South Australia. They've spent more money here than anywhere else. There's bricks everywhere. And bricks mean money. You've got to buy them, you've got to transport them there, you've got to lay them, this is money. So when you see bricks on a whaling station site, you start going, oh, they've spent some money here. And they spent £900 in a season, and their return for that season was £600. Now, this is Ansett of the 1840s. This isn't going to work for very long. So effectively what they're saying is, this is not highly successful, this isn't very lucrative, and I think we'll give it away. And they do. By the middle 1840s, virtually all of these whaling stations are gone. There's nothing left. And they're in such remote places, of course, that nobody comes along for years afterwards, until the pastoralists trot out there in the 1860s and 1870s.
and even they don't like the areas the whalers are working because it's too dry. Anyway, I have probably rambled on more than enough.
Thank you, Mark. I can't help but think you're a detective in a lot of ways. You find yourself in out-of-the-way places, piecing things together, which has ended in a lot of research on a topic which I think is generally very, very poorly or very little understood in this state. Just starting with a lack of records is an impediment to your work, and through your trailblazing you've come across a lot of history that is unknown. You've pieced that together, and I was sitting there thinking, you can see what happened on the sites, you can appreciate what they did, but it's very hard for us to, in this day and age, to imagine the conditions in which they lived and at times the hive of activity that those sites would have been. It's quite obvious that your work is your passion. You've been at it for a long time now. You're making a very good contribution, an outstanding contribution to the heritage of South Australia and our understanding. And you're also, through that work, bringing skills to new people who will further that work of yours. So very well done, and thank you for presenting to us this evening.